Picture a Senate hearing room where the air feels too dry and the lights feel too bright. The kind of place that makes every blink look suspicious on camera. Now imagine Senator John Kennedy of Louisiana leaning back like he's about to ask a neighbor for a cup of sugar, not corner a political titan under oath. He starts with the kind of question that's almost insultingly simple, the kind that's supposed to warm up the witness and calm down the room. Madam Speaker, former Madam Speaker, I apologize. What year did you first become Speaker of the House? And instead of an instant answer, you get a pause that lasts just long enough to change the temperature in the room. It's not a dramatic pause, not the kind someone uses to craft a clever line for the evening shows. It's the pause of someone reaching for a memory that should be sitting right on top of the stack and finding the drawer empty. Nancy Pelosi sits at the witness table with two high-dollar attorneys flanking her, the sort of lawyers who look like they bill by the inhale. She opens her mouth, closes it, then opens it again like she's trying to catch the right number before it slips away. The cameras tighten, because that's what cameras do when something unplanned shows up. If you've watched politics long enough, you know how standard theater usually goes. The witness gives a polished answer. The senator performs a polished outrage. The clips get chopped, and everyone goes home to fundraise off the performance. But this doesn't feel polished, not even in a cynical way. It feels awkward, in the way a family dinner feels awkward when somebody asks a question everybody assumed didn't need asking. 10 seconds turn into 15, and the silence starts to sound louder than the microphones. Pelosi finally reaches for a lifeline, the general story. That was when we took back the House, she says, which is true, in a broad, historical sense, and still not what was asked. Kennedy stays gentle, almost kindly, like he's correcting a date on a form at the DMV. January 2007, ma'am, he says, and the room hears the correction land with a dull thud. 17 years isn't an obscure trivia fact when you're talking about one of the most powerful posts in American government. Kennedy doesn't pounce, at least not in the loud way people expect pouncing. He just keeps the same porch swing voice and asks the next obvious question. What year did you become Speaker the second time? This pause is longer, and that's where the attorneys start shifting the way lawyers shift when they can feel a narrative forming without their permission. One leans as if to whisper, and Kennedy lifts a hand, polite but firm, asking to hear it from her own memory. Pelosi looks down at the table as if the date might be written in the grain of the wood. 2019, she says. But she says it the way people say something they hope is right, not something they know is right. Kennedy gives her the confirmation, then builds a simple timeline out loud. Speaker, then not Speaker, then Speaker again. He says it slowly, so nobody can pretend they missed it, and so the audience at home can follow along without a law degree. Then he asks the kind of question that's not really a question, more like a reminder of weight. He lists what the job meant: classified briefings, legislative control, national stakes, and he asks whether she remembers that time well. She answers the way a veteran power broker answers, "Of course I do." So Kennedy nods, like he's satisfied, then gently turns the steering wheel toward why everyone tuned in. Good, he says. Then you'll remember the stock trades. He flips a document like a man about to read a grocery list, not a line of accusations. Now, before we go any further, let me say out loud what this is and what it isn't. This is a dramatized political scenario, a piece of narrative commentary that asks questions the way political talkers ask questions when they want viewers leaning forward. It isn't a medical diagnosis, and it isn't a declaration of guilt, because neither of those things should be made by vibes on a live stream. But it is a demonstration of how optics become argument in modern America, and how a single shaky moment can reframe an entire story. And once that happens, facts don't disappear, but they do have to fight harder to be heard. Kennedy picks a date that sounds like it comes with its own soundtrack, March 15, 2020. He calls it a Sunday in the middle of early COVID panic, a time when the country felt like it was holding its breath and watching the market drop in real time. He asks whether she remembers the day, and she offers a partial memory. Yes, COVID was happening, without committing to the specific. Then he says the kind of thing that makes people sit up because it has a number attached, a multi-million-dollar options trade tied to a pharmaceutical company. He asks if she remembers that trade, and she answers with a phrase Washington people use the way teenagers use, I don't know, my husband handles our investments. That line isn't new in politics, and it's not automatically sinister. Plenty of couples divide responsibilities, and plenty of public officials to keep some distance from financial details because they're busy and because they're advised to be careful. But Kennedy doesn't let it serve as an off-ramp. He lifts a disclosure form and points to a signature. The kind of signature that looks neat and practiced from decades of signing official documents. He asks if she recognizes it, and in this imagined scene, she stares at it like it's familiar but not emotionally attached. If you're watching at home, you can already feel your brain trying to choose a lane. One lane says this is a routine dodge, the standard "I don't manage it" line designed to avoid specifics. Another lane says the hesitation looks different, heavier, like it isn't strategy, but uncertainty. And a third lane says none of this matters unless there's evidence of wrongdoing, and optics are not evidence. All three lanes are reasonable, which is exactly why this kind of moment becomes combustible. Kennedy ties the trade to the legislative calendar, because that's how you turn money into a story. He references a major relief bill, big numbers, urgent timing, the sense that Washington was moving fast while the public was scared. He doesn't say, "You did X," at least not as a direct criminal claim. He asks how the timing should be understood. He leans in and asks another question that sounds simple, but carries a deeper implication. Do you know what day it is today? And that's the moment the room stops feeling like an ethics hearing and starts feeling like something else entirely. Because the question isn't really about Thursday, it's about capacity, awareness, control, and who's actually driving the bus when the person in the public seat looks unsure. Pelosi looks up, then to her attorneys, then back. And if you're writing this as a voiceover script, you let the silence hang just long enough for viewers to project their own conclusions. A whisper happens, quiet, quick, the kind that the microphones can't fully capture, but the cameras absolutely catch. She repeats the day, and Kennedy points out that she repeated it after being prompted. Now, in real life, a moment like that could mean 10 things that are not scandal. Someone could be tired, distracted, irritated, thrown off by the setting, focused on legal strategy, or simply having a bad memory day like every human alive. A person can also misspeak in public without it being a sign of collapse, because humans are not teleprompters. But politics isn't patient, and television is less patient than politics. So Kennedy asks the follow-up that, in a dramatized scenario, feels like a trapdoor opening. Whether she's under a doctor's care for memory problems. The room goes silent in a way that feels like everybody is suddenly aware of the audience. Pelosi's attorneys object. Because, of course, they object. Because that question is loaded, no matter how gently it's spoken. Kennedy's defenders say it's relevant to whether she understood documents she signed and statements she made. Kennedy's critics say it's a cheap shot dressed up as concern, a way to humiliate an elderly public figure on national television. And the truth, if we're being honest, could contain a piece of both, because American politics rarely gives you pure motives. Here's the twist that makes the whole thing narratively irresistible. The hearing stops being about stock trades and turns into a referendum on competence. When that happens, the public doesn't just ask, were the trades ethical? They ask, who was steering? And who benefited? And if she didn't remember, who did? That's not a courtroom question, it's a civics and trust question, which is why it spreads faster than any spreadsheet ever will. And once it spreads, it doesn't stay polite. In this dramatized version, the backstory starts earlier that same morning, because every good political thriller loves a ticking clock. Reporters fill the heart-building hallway like it's a movie premiere, camera tripods stacked like weapons, producers whispering into headsets. The room itself has that heavy Senate look. Dark wood, brass fixtures, institutional seriousness. Like the building is trying to remind everyone it's bigger than their little scandal. The hearing had been triggered, in the script, by a tough investigative story that laid out a pattern of suspiciously well-timed trades by lawmakers. And because pattern is the word that makes people angry, without needing to say crime, the story caught fire. Pelosi arrives looking like Pelosi, which is to say, controlled, expensive, unbothered, tailored down to the last stitch. She's flanked by counsel, because that's what you do when you expect a fight. She carries herself like someone who spent decades being the adult in the room, which is why a single moment of blankness reads as catastrophic. The more iconic the public image, the more fragile it becomes, because people treat icons like they're supposed to be consistent. So when the script shows her looking confused, the audience feels like they're watching a monument wobble. Meanwhile, Kennedy's preparation is framed like the setup to a chess match. He's portrayed as the underestimated Southern senator whose folksy delivery hides a sharp mind and a sharper sense of timing. In the script, he isn't building a criminal case because he doesn't need to. He's building a narrative case. He's collecting clips, transcripts, moments where words don't line up, moments where dates slip, moments where people around her seem to correct her in real time. He's not proving anything by itself. He's arranging dots in a way that makes the public connect them. And that, right there, is the real commentary about modern oversight. A hearing is supposed to gather facts, but in the age of clips, it also gathers moments. Moments become meaning. Meaning becomes belief. Belief becomes political reality. The audience rarely reads the full record. They absorb the vibe and then recruit facts to support the vibe. So the script keeps returning to simple questions, because simple questions are where vibes live. Kennedy asks names, presidents, vice presidents, party leaders, because those are supposed to be automatic if you've lived inside Washington power for decades. She answers some correctly, hesitates on others, and one stumble becomes the seed that grows into a forest. He keeps his tone mild, because mild is what makes the confrontation feel more credible to viewers who are exhausted by shouting. The Democrats on the dais protest that it's unfair, that it's age-baiting, that it's a distraction from the real topic. And Kennedy's camp says, with that same calm, that competence is never a distraction when you're talking about power. Then the script slides back to the money, because it has to, and money is the engine. He references trades, dates, legislative events, the uncanny rhythm of bye-bye vote, bye-bye briefing, sell headline. He asks whether she remembers specifics, and she answers with generalities and distance. Again, that could be strategy, it could be caution, it could be genuine lack of recall, or it could be some mix of all three. The script doesn't declare which, because it's designed to keep the viewer arguing with themselves. He brings up deposition language, "I don't recall," because that phrase is catnip for people who already think Washington is slippery. A lawyer would tell you that "I don't recall" can be a safe answer even when a witness remembers something imperfectly. A political viewer will tell you "I don't recall" is what guilty people say when they're cornered. A sympathetic viewer will tell you it's what anyone says when they don't want to be trapped into a misstatement under oath. All of those interpretations compete in the public arena, and the script turns that competition into drama. Then comes the pivot that makes this story feel like a dagger. The idea that a person could be simultaneously powerful and vulnerable. If she truly isn't tracking dates or signatures, then the public starts thinking about the people around her. Staff, allies, family, advisors. Who had access? Who had influence? Who decided what she signed? Who decided what she said? Again, those are not accusations. They're questions that naturally arise when viewers sense a gap between public authority and private capacity. And once those questions are out there, the system itself becomes the target, not just the person. Because nobody wants to believe the country can be run on autopilot. But nobody wants to believe the country isn't already being run that way in 1,000 small ways. So the hearing, in this dramatized telling, becomes a confrontation with the unspoken. How many powerful people stay in place because everyone benefits from pretending they're fine? A staffer benefits because their job continues. A party benefits because a fundraising machine stays humming. A caucus benefits because an experienced operator still pulls levers behind closed doors. The public, though, benefits from none of that. The public just gets the bill and the consequences and the nagging feeling that nobody is really in charge. So when Kennedy frames his questions as concern rather than attack, it lands with a certain segment of viewers who are tired of theatrics. And it enrages another segment who see concern as a costume, a polite wrapper around a brutal political goal. That split is the gasoline, and the media ecosystem is the match. In the script, clips go viral immediately because they're simple and devastating. "Do you know what day it is a line you can understand without context, which means it travels without context. A long hearing doesn't go viral. A short moment does. Pundits pile on, some cautiously, some gleefully, some with faux sympathy that feels like a knife wrapped in a silk napkin. Experts appear on TV to talk about what the moment could indicate, because could is the magic word that keeps everyone legally safe and socially reckless. Then, as the story grows, the system tries to put a lid on it with a statement. In a dramatized political world, statements are always carefully worded, always focused on health, always asking for privacy, always committed to service. But a statement can't unclip a clip. A statement can't put the toothpaste back in the tube, especially when the toothpaste has already been remixed into memes with captions like, "This is who ran the house?" And as the script would have it, the questions grow in scale. Not just what happened, but how long has this been happening? That's the part that makes people furious, even people who don't care about the original allegation. Because voters can forgive a lot, but they hate feeling like they were expected to pretend. They hate feeling like they were told everything was fine when it wasn't fine. And they really hate the suspicion that the people in the room knew it and kept it quiet because it was convenient. So the script makes that suspicion the climax, because it's the most relatable moral emotion in politics: betrayal. Now, does the script have to end with a courtroom? Not necessarily, and honestly, it's more believable if it doesn't. Washington has 1,000 exits that look like dignity while still leaving questions hanging in the air. A resignation framed as time with family can be both true and strategic. A temporary leave can be both compassionate and calculated. and a quiet fade from public life can be both humane and frustrating for anyone who wanted answers. So the ending in this version leans into ambiguity the way modern political reality does. Pelosi steps back, perhaps after consultation, perhaps after an evaluation, perhaps after reflection, because those words can mean anything and everything. Kennedy gives a measured interview somewhere safer than a national studio, claiming he wasn't trying to humiliate, but to force a hard conversation. Supporters insist the hearing was cruel, a cheap spectacle built on one person's aging face. Critics insist it was overdue, proof that the country has no mechanism to handle decline except a viral clip. And the public is left holding the same two questions at once, like a weight in each hand. One question is about money and ethics, which is always messy and often boring until you attach it to a character people recognize. The other question is about competence and power, which is never boring because it hits the fear that nobody is minding the store. The script refuses to convict anyone because it's not a court, and it's not meant to be. Instead, it asks what it would mean if the people around a leader were doing more steering than the public knew. It asks what it would mean if a signature became a formality rather than a conscious act. And it asks something even more uncomfortable, the question Americans avoid because it sounds heartless until it becomes personal. What does a democracy do when a beloved or hated leader is no longer clearly up to the job, but the system around them has incentives to keep them there? Is the answer compassion, accountability, both? Neither. Do we demand transparency even when it feels cruel, or do we protect privacy even when it risks public trust? If you can't answer that cleanly, congratulations, you're human. And you've just discovered why this kind of story spreads. Because the story isn't really about one person in one chair on one Thursday. It's about the tension between image and reality, between institutions and bodies, between the mythology of permanent competence and the fact that no one stays sharp forever. It's about how power can outlive the person wearing it, at least for a while, because the machine doesn't like interruptions. It's about how oversight can be both necessary and theatrical, and sometimes the theater is the only way the public notices oversight exists. And it's about how a single soft-spoken question can punch a hole in a narrative that took decades to build. So the final beat isn't a gavel slam or a perp walk or a triumphant speech. It's a camera close-up, a moment of uncertainty, a whisper from counsel, and the realization, fair or unfair, that the public just saw something they can't unsee. Some viewers will interpret it as proof of corruption, others as proof of cruelty, others as proof that aging is real, and politics is merciless. And a lot of viewers will simply feel a cold flash of anxiety that the people making national decisions might not always be as present as the job requires. That anxiety doesn't pick a party, and it doesn't need an indictment to take root. If you want to end it like an American political narrator who's seen too much and still tries to be honest, you end on the questions, not the verdict. Who knew what, and when did they know it? Who was signing what, and with how much awareness? If the trades were innocent, why does the timing look like a magic trick? If the memory slips were innocent, why did they feel so visible once the camera stared long enough? And if the system can't handle these moments with dignity and transparency at the same time, what does that say about the system, not the person? The next part was the part nobody prepares for, because Washington is great at rehearsed conflict and terrible at unscripted discomfort. Within minutes of Pelosi leaving the room, the hearing stopped being a hearing and became raw footage. And raw footage doesn't care about anyone's preferred framing. The networks didn't even need commentary at first. They just ran the tape, again and again, because the tape did the job by itself. You could almost watch producers making the same calculation at the same time. This isn't policy. This is a human moment. And human moments beat policy every day of the week. By lunchtime, the entire city was speaking in that clipped, half-whispered way it speaks when everyone knows the story is bigger than the press releases. Kennedy didn't gloat, at least not in public, and that restraint actually made it sting more for Pelosi's defenders. A politician celebrating would have been easy to condemn. You can call it petty, cruel, partisan, whatever word fits your audience, but a politician keeping his voice soft and his posture calm forces people to argue with the content instead of the tone. And in politics, tone is usually the escape hatch. That day, the escape hatch was welded shut by a 23-second clip that looked like a simple question and felt like a national gut punch. By 2 p.m., the first wave of statements hit the wires, and you could tell who had time to workshop theirs. Some Democrats went straight to, "This is inappropriate," which was true in the sense that it felt like the kind of thing you don't do to someone you've watched in power for decades. Some Republicans went straight to "the people deserve answers," which was true in the sense that voters rarely get honest answers about the health and capacity of their leaders. A smaller group, the ones who live in the uncomfortable middle, tried to split the difference. Respect her service. Take the concerns seriously. That line always sounds reasonable, but it also always sounds like someone reading a manual titled "How to Talk Without Saying Anything." And the public, unsurprisingly, heard the emptiness in it. The cable panels filled up fast, and you could almost feel the producers hunting for two kinds of guests: outrage and authority. Outrage is easy to book, because outrage is everywhere and never sleeps. Authority is harder, because real authority speaks slowly and avoids certainty, and slow uncertainty is bad television. So you got a familiar parade of former officials, former strategists, former everything, each one squinting at the same footage and describing what it might mean. Might became the word of the week, the little legal cushion that lets people insinuate without declaring. And as the day rolled on, might did what it always does. It turned into "sure looks like" in the public mind. Pelosi's team tried to do the standard playbook first, flood the zone with alternative narratives. They sent out allies to remind viewers of her accomplishments, her decades of service, the legislation she shepherded, the barriers she broke. They emphasized that she was not on trial for her age, that America shouldn't become a place where you punish public figures for growing older in public. They hinted that Kennedy's questioning was performance, which, frankly, it was in the way all televised oversight is performance. But the problem was that none of those talking points answered the only question the clip had planted in everyone's head. Why did she look lost? You can't drown out a simple visual with a complex defense, because visuals are what people believe when they don't feel like thinking. Then came the second wave, the subtler one, the one Washington uses when it realizes denial won't work. The language shifted from ridiculous to concerning, from attack to health, from partisan to privacy. If you've been around politics long enough, you recognize the pivot. They were moving toward an exit ramp. Not because anyone was admitting wrongdoing, and not because anyone wanted to hand Kennedy a trophy, but because the footage had made the situation unmanageable. A leader can survive a policy dispute, a scandal, even a bad election year. What's harder to survive is the perception of fragility, because fragility makes every future appearance a test. And then the whispers started showing up in print, the kind journalists can't resist because they sound like insiders while still being deniable. Some members have privately expressed concern. Several colleagues have noticed moments. Aides have adjusted schedules. Staffers have quietly intervened. Nobody's name attached, lots of passive voice, the classic Washington way of saying something while claiming you didn't. Those lines are gasoline because they imply what voters already suspect, that the people closest to power know more than the public does. And maybe they do, or maybe it's just the rumor ecosystem feeding itself. But once that suspicion is awake, it doesn't go back to sleep. Kennedy, for his part, leaned into the narrowest defensible frame: process. He didn't say, "She's this" or "she's that." He said, "She couldn't answer basic questions in a public hearing, and that raises issues we can't ignore." He talked about responsibility, about transparency, about the difference between respect for a person and accountability to the public. He made it sound like civics instead of combat, which is exactly why it got traction beyond his base. Because the public is tired of combat, but they still want somebody to take the steering wheel seriously. The most interesting reaction wasn't from the loud partisans, though. It was from the quiet professionals, the former chiefs of staff, the committee lawyers, the procedural nerds who actually understand how the place functions. They started asking the questions that never make it into speeches because they're too unromantic. If a member's capacity is in doubt, what is the formal mechanism to address it? Who triggers it, and what standards apply? And who decides what fit means in a system built to avoid moral judgments? And what happens if the answer is nothing, which, in practice, is often the answer until the problem becomes too public to ignore? Those questions are dangerous because they point at the institution, not the individual, and institutions hate mirrors. The stock trading angle didn't disappear, but it shifted into a different register. Before the hearing, it was a controversy about timing, optics, and fairness. Why do lawmakers seem to do so well in markets ordinary people can't predict? After the hearing, it became a deeper, darker question that people asked in bars and group chats. If she wasn't fully on top of things, then who was? Again, that's not a verdict. It's a suspicion that grows naturally when you watch a public figure appear uncertain. Suspicion isn't proof, but suspicion drives politics the way gravity drives water. And once suspicion attaches to money, it becomes sticky, because money is the one bipartisan language Americans actually speak fluently. Pelosi's office finally released the kind of statement that signals a controlled retreat. It praised her service, emphasized her commitment, asked for privacy, and mentioned a comprehensive evaluation without specifying what that meant. There was no press conference, no Q&A, no moment where she could be trapped by another simple question. That absence was strategic, but it also looked like avoidance to the public, and avoidance always reads like confirmation to people who already distrust you. It wasn't fair, necessarily, but fairness is not the metric viral narratives use. Viral narratives run on the fuel of "why won't they just answer?" even when the answer is complicated, personal, or inappropriate for public consumption. Behind the scenes, you could almost see the calendar math happening. Every scheduled appearance became a risk. Every live hit became a gamble. Every slip of the tongue became a potential sequel clip. That's the part most voters never see. At a certain level, politics becomes risk management for the image of competence. And once the image is cracked, the safest move is usually to reduce the chances of more cracks. So the schedule shrinks, the public exposure narrows, the statements become written, and the person becomes less present. Meanwhile, Pelosi's allies started using a different vocabulary, the kind that tries to be compassionate while still protecting the institution. They began praising her legacy in the past tense without saying the words past tense. They talked about a chapter, transition, next generation, the gentle language of political succession. They avoided Kennedy's name when possible, because naming your antagonist gives him power. And they tried to separate health from ethics, even though the public had already fused those concepts into one emotional story. Once the public fuses a story, you can't unfuse it with adjectives. The coverage produced one of those rare moments where the country argues about something real instead of symbolic. Not abortion, not guns, not flags. Those are all real too, but they're also tribal markers at this point. This was different. It was about whether leaders should have to demonstrate competence in a visible way, and who gets to decide what competence means. It was about whether privacy should protect public officials from scrutiny that might be humiliating, even if that scrutiny is relevant to power. It was about whether parties have a moral duty to step in before voters are forced to watch a decline play out on live television. And because there isn't a clean answer, everybody got to feel both righteous and uneasy at the same time. Then came the inevitable reform chatter, because Washington loves reform chatter the way people love New Year's resolutions. Lawmakers floated proposals, tighter disclosure windows, blind trusts, bans on individual stock trading for members and spouses, independent oversight bodies. Some of those ideas were sincere, and some were opportunistic, and some were both, because sincerity and opportunism are not mutually exclusive in politics. Democrats said, "We've been pushing reforms for years," and Republicans said, "Then why didn't you pass them when you had power?" Republicans said, "We're finally going to clean this up," and Democrats said, "Then why didn't you clean it up when your people were profiting too?" And the public, watching the back and forth, rolled their eyes because they've seen this movie, and they know the ending is usually a watered-down bill and a triumphant press release. But here's what the script would emphasize if it wanted to keep tension. Even if reforms happen, they don't solve the deeper issue. The deeper issue is the human one. The country keeps electing older leaders, and parties keep rewarding seniority. And institutions keep avoiding direct conversations about decline until decline becomes spectacle. We don't have a cultural language for it that isn't cruel or dismissive. We either pretend aging doesn't exist, or we turn aging into a weapon. And that binary guarantees the ugliest possible outcome: a public collapse captured in HD, packaged into clips, argued over by strangers, and then used as a cudgel by everyone with an agenda. If you were writing this for voiceover, you'd slow down there, because that's the part that hits viewers in the stomach. In the days that followed, Kennedy became the face of a question bigger than he was. To supporters, he was the guy who finally said what everyone else was too scared to say. To critics, he was the guy who humiliated a historic figure for political profit. To the media, he was ratings, because controversy is content, and content is currency. And to Washington insiders, he was a warning. If you bring someone in under oath, you can't control what the cameras catch. That warning mattered because it threatened the real glue of the place, which is not ideology, but mutual protection. The story also did something quietly radical. It made people talk about staff. Not in the usual deep state cartoon way, but in a practical way. Who writes the statements? Who schedules the days? Who decides what gets signed? Who sits in the room when decisions are made? In a healthy system, staff supports a leader who is fully engaged and making choices. In an unhealthy system, staff can become the buffer, the manager, sometimes even the de facto operator, without anyone formally admitting that's what's happening. Again, not an accusation, just a structural reality that becomes more plausible to the public when they watch a leader struggle to answer basic questions. And once the public starts looking at staff, the institution starts sweating, because staff is where accountability goes to blur. If you want a dramatic pivot point for the continuation of this story, it's not a new allegation. It's a private meeting that leaks, because everything leaks when it matters. In this dramatized world, you can imagine senior Democrats sitting with Pelosi's inner circle, not out of malice, but out of triage. They talk about what she wants, what she can handle, what the public will tolerate, what the district needs, what the party fears. They talk about dignity, which is the word politicians use when they mean exit without catastrophe. They talk about timing, because timing is everything, and the wrong timing turns compassion into chaos. And even if everyone in that room has good intentions, the conversation still has a hard edge, because power is not sentimental. So the ending you set up isn't a villain getting punished. It's a system revealing what it values. If Pelosi steps back, some will call it accountability, some will call it tragedy, and some will call it cover. If she doesn't step back, every appearance becomes a test. Every test becomes a clip. And the story eats itself until it consumes everything else. And Kennedy, whether you like him or not, becomes the narrator of that uncomfortable truth. The country can't rely on vibes of competence. It needs verifiable competence. But then you land the final question that keeps viewers arguing. Who gets to verify it? And by what standard? And how do you do it without turning human decline into entertainment? That's the moment you end on if you're trying to keep the tension alive, because the audience doesn't need you to declare who's guilty or who's sick. They need you to make them feel the contradiction. We want transparency, but we hate cruelty. We want accountability, but we fear weaponization. We want leaders to be human, but we demand superhuman steadiness. And once you make them sit inside that contradiction, they'll keep watching. Not because you yelled louder, but because you made the story about something bigger than the names on the screen.